Let's talk about now the basics of stimulus plans. The government not only wants to give away things in terms of just direct items like phones and student loans and solar panels. The government is giving away more and more under the auspices of the stimulus plan. Even this week, as you probably all know, there was another stimulus plan passed by Congress, about $2 trillion roughly. That would put the total at somewhere between 5 and 7 trillion that we have used in stimulus money since in 1 year. Just to put that in perspective, it took us over 200 years as a nation to get $5 trillion in the hole. And now we have gone 5 to 7 trillion in the hole in 1 year. So we've got stimulus plans. The first one that I remember, the first time I remember hearing the word stimulus was around 2001, 2002, after 9/11. I believe I got a stimulus. There was a stimulus program from George W. Bush. And then there was another one in 2008, the early stages of the Great Recession. And Obama had one after that, about 2009 or 10. And then, of course, last year we had another one. And in the book, I go through a short history of stimulus plans. But are stimulus plans good? People are calling for these, begging for these. Senators say we have to have them. We need them. The people need them. But do we really need them? Do they work? And what are the downsides of stimulus plans? First of all, let's define what a stimulus plan is. Here's how I'll define it. A stimulus plan is a coordinated effort by the government to pull the economy out of a recession or a depression. It's when the government does a certain set of things to try and get the economy going again. That's the phrase you'll need to get the economy going again. And a stimulus plan has, there are a number of things that can be done under the umbrella term of a stimulus plan. Stimulus simply means to stimulate. But there are 6 things, and let's just hit these briefly. We won't spend a lot of time on them. They're pretty self-explanatory. First of all, there's government spending. The government not only will send money to individuals, we'll talk about that in a moment, but they'll buy stuff. They'll buy more tanks, more bombs, they'll buy more things. The government will become basically a bigger customer to businesses to try and get the economy going. And then the government will make cash payments to individuals and to states. I would not be surprised if this last stimulus here is not loaded with money for blue states that have poorly managed their money because they've moved towards socialism, and now they need to be bailed out. But the government will give money to individuals and to states. The government will also give money to businesses or make loans to businesses that businesses may not have to pay back. So we have government spending, cash payments to individuals and states. We have cash payments to businesses. There will also be tax cuts sometimes in stimulus plans, reducing the amount that we have to pay out of our weekly paycheck in taxes to give us more money to spend on things in the economy. Also, the government will try and adjust the money supply. They'll make money available for loans more easily, or they'll lower interest rates, that kind of thing, to try and get things going. And then finally, the government will adjust regulation. This is one of the things that President Trump did during his administration, was he cut a lot of the red tape, cut a lot of the rules that companies had to jump through in order to do business. And that the basic idea is that will help a business get going and get the economy going. But if you'll notice here, most of these things have to do with the government either spending money or not taking in as much money in taxes. Government spending is the government putting money out into the economy. Cash payments to individual states and businesses are the government spending money, putting money out into the economy. And tax cuts. Tax cuts are the government saying, you don't have to send me that money, you keep it. So in a way, it's the government reducing its income to give you more money. But what's the logic behind a stimulus plan? Why does the government do these things? Well, in order to understand that, we have to do a little bit of Economics 101 here. Why does the government spend money when the economy is bad? It's not just that little bit of money that the government spends. Now, I know that $2 trillion is a lot of money, but when you've got a $20 trillion economy, $2 trillion is really not that much money. It's only about 10%. So why does the government spend money? Why does the government infuse money into the economy when it gets bad? It's because they believe the money will multiply. It's called the spending multiplier. This is an economics idea that sort of drives the government to do these things, the spending multiplier. The idea is that the money that the government spends, so the government spends $1, will produce more than $1 in the economy. Well, you say, how does that work? Well, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about something called the marginal propensity to consume. Now, I know, don't get afraid of this term. It's actually not very complicated. Marginal propensity to consume, the MPC. All that is, it has to do with when you get $1 as a consumer, how much of that dollar do you spend and how much do you save? So if I give you $1, are you going to take that whole dollar and put it in the bank? Are you going to spend 50 cents and keep 50? What are you going to do? Whatever the percentage is the MPC. And it's expressed as the number 1 or less. So if you spend 100% of that dollar, then the MPC is 1. And this has to do with calculating the spending multiplier. Let's look at some examples here. So if you consume 80% of every dollar that you get, the MPC is 0.8. Now you're not going to have to worry about a formula here. I'm not going to give you a formula. I'm just trying to help you understand why the government does this or the thinking behind it. If you consume 50 cents of every dollar, the MPC is 0.5. Well, the MPC is directly related to this spending multiplier that the government is trying to make happen. So the question that the government is always asking is, if I spend money, if I spend $1, how much is that producing in the economy? That's the spending multiplier. So here's what happens. Here's how this works, and this is how we figure out, or we try to figure out, how much $1 of government spending will produce in the economy to get the economy going again. Let's say the government spends $100. Let's say it buys something for $100. And let's say that the MPC, the marginal propensity to consume, is 0.8. That means you're going to spend, if you get that dollar from the government, you're going to spend $100. You get $100 from the government, you're going to spend $80. Well, the next guy that gets that $80, he's going to spend 80% of that $80, and that's 64. And the next person that gets that 64 is going to spend 80% of that, and so on down the line until the money's all gone. Well, this is why the government does this, because if you spend $100, and most people in the country that get the money are spending 80% of it, then it produces $500 in the economy. Do you see how that works? So the idea is if you spend $2 trillion, that if people are spending 80% of what they get, then as it goes on down the line, that $2 trillion becomes $10 trillion. Now that's a big deal. If the MPC is 0.5, or you're spending half that $100, then the multiplier is 200. You don't need to remember these terms, and you don't need to remember this math. All you need to know is that when the government spends that money, the reason it's doing it is because it thinks it will multiply. But does it? That's the question, isn't it? Do stimulus plans work? In my research, I found a fascinating report done by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And it's called A Historical and Statistical Analysis of U.S. Fiscal Stimulus Activity from 1953 to 2011. Now I know that's a lot of big words, but basically what they did was they went back and they looked at every stimulus of every presidential administration from 1953 up to 2011. All right? Almost 60 years. And then they tried to analyze what those administrations did for stimulus and what effect it had on the economy, both in the short and the long term. It's a fascinating report. I know you'll all download it today. It's like 25 pages and you all read it. But here's what they said. This is how they concluded. This report concluded, there is no significant relationship between changes in government spending during recessions and economic growth at any point from 1 to 10 years later. In summary, regardless of the time horizon, and regardless of whether the economy is in recession or expansion, the data exhibit no evidence of stimulus spending having any effect on economic growth. What they're saying is, look, we did the analysis. We looked at what was done in each administration. We looked at the economic data. And what we found was that all the spending that the government did had no measurable effect, either short-term or long-term, on the economy. 1 to 10 years later. They don't work, is what this report said. Why, though? Why did they not work? Why don't they work? Why don't they work? Let's look at some reasons the report pointed out. And again, these won't be too technical, but just hang with me and I'll explain them to you, because I want you to understand why, not just what I'm saying, but why I'm saying it. First, there is the recognition problem. Most of the time, the government can't recognize a recession, that means when the economy is going down, for 6, 12, or 18 months after it's happened. So when the government finally gets around to doing something, it's too late to make any kind of significant difference. It was needed back when the symptoms were manifesting themselves. So there's a recognition problem. And then there's a timing problem. The government takes a long time to get bills through Congress, to figure out what it needs to do, to take actions in the market, whatever. So not only do you have this recognition problem, but you also have a time, once we realize what we need to do, it takes us months to do something. So that releases or reduces the effect of the stimulus. And then there's the coordination problem. Remember, we talked about things like adjusting the money supply. We talked about things like changing regulations. We talked about things like government spending programs. All of those require all of these complex, massive government entities to get their stuff together and do things in a particular way in a particular timing. It's very difficult for the government to do that, as you can imagine. And then there's the multiplier problem. The multiplier problem simply means that the government is usually expecting the multiplier to be much higher than it actually is. I don't know about you, but I got 2 stimulus checks from my family last year, and I saved both of them. So what is my multiplier? 0. So they spent that money, but I did not spend any of it in the economy. I saved it. You see that? So we've got the multiplier problem. So in the end, stimulus plans won't work. But like free stuff, like free government giveaways, there are bigger problems that stimulus plans create. First of all is that all stimulus programs are funded by debt. Let me show you how you can tell this. Every single program is funded by debt. In 2001, the national debt was at $6 trillion. 2001 was the last time the government ran a surplus. In other words, that's the last time the government income was greater than what it spent. Every year since 2001, 20 years in a row, we have run deficits, which means we're spending more than we take in. Guess what it was in 2020? It was $27 trillion. We have added $21 trillion in debt in 20 years. That's a 450% growth of our debt. And when we get to our main sessions next Sunday and the following Sunday, which I'll be doing live at church, we're going to hammer away at this debt and see what an anchor it is around our nation and how it could end up very likely destroying us. All stimulus programs are funded by debt. This $1.9 trillion that was just passed, every single penny must be borrowed. So when you get that check, you have received money from the government that the government had to borrow to give you. That's not the only problem, though. What other problems does this constant cry for stimulus manifest in our culture? You know, people are going crazy to get that stimulus money. There are articles on the internet all the time. When are we going to get our money? When are we going to get our money? You need the money. You need the money. What is it showing? As we continue to look to government more and more to protect us, to provide for us, what is that showing? It is showing a worship of government. And this is exactly what socialism wants. The socialist wants you to look to government, the state, as God. The state is God in socialism. It makes all the decisions. It has all the income. It has all the resources. It determines who gets what and when and how. And as we become less godly of a society, with less integrity, less work ethic, and as we turn more and more to government, our first petition in the United States these days when bad things happen is not to our Creator, but to our legislators. And this is revealing, this constant call for stimulus is revealing a worship of government. And I want to remind you, God allows no one to be worshiped but Him. Another problem with stimulus plans, another thing that they manifest in our nation, Christians included, myself included, is a failure to prepare for bad times. We don't save anymore. We don't put back anymore. We live hand to mouth, check by check to check to check, paycheck to paycheck. We consume everything that we make. We borrow for boats and we spend our money on interest payments on credit cards, and we do not prepare. So when something happens and there is a run on the supermarkets, we freak out because we have not prepared. When we have unemployment, when we get laid off from a job, we look into the government, give me more money, because I have not saved to prepare for myself. But God is very much against this. Proverbs 22:3. A prudent man foresees evil and hides himself. A prudent man foresees evil and hides himself. What is it saying? It's saying that somebody who is wise is going to look out into the future and say, you know what? I may actually go on unemployment at some time. I could lose my job. Therefore, I need to hide myself. I need to put something away so that I can take care of my family if I'm unemployed. A wise man looks out there and says, hey, you know, sometimes crazy things happen in this country, in this culture, and I need to have a storage of food and gas and a generator. So I need to take some of my money today, and I need to use it to prepare for that evil, that difficulty that I see coming in the future. But when we see these stimulus plans and we see these cries for stimulus and everybody needs the money, what are we seeing? We're seeing a nation that does not prepare for itself, a nation that does not set aside anything. Ideally, a Christian should never have to take from government, even in emergencies. Did you hear that? Ideally, a Christian should never have to take from government, even in emergencies. God's Word teaches hard work, self-control, saving, and preparation for future hard times. A Christian family that practices these disciplines over the course of years should never need a handout from government, whether following a storm, during a season of unemployment, or in the case of a pandemic. While there are exceptions in a world of sin, divorce, human weakness, and catastrophe, God's Word sets the goal firmly above us. But if anyone does not provide for his own, the Lord said, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And in another place he said, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. These verses place the burden squarely on the shoulders of the believer to provide for himself and his family in every situation, and never to look for government for that which God has commanded him to supply himself. Stimulus plans, brothers and sisters, looking to the government to save us, looking for them to bail us out, is completely the opposite of God's wisdom, and it is setting us up for a catastrophe, both individually and as a nation. And then finally, what does it show about us as a nation? Stimulus plans reveal our fear of suffering. You notice how people today are scared to death for anything to go wrong. Scared to death for the economy to slow down. Scared to death that they might get unemployed, that they might get a virus, that they might get anything. People don't want to suffer at all today. We are so afraid that things are going to go wrong. But what we need to realize is that God sends trials to both individuals and nations to discipline and train them so that things can get better in the future. But we have avoided this. We do not want this. We have become such a foolish society. Psalm 119:67 says, before I was afflicted, I went astray. but now I keep your word. You see what happened here? But he said, look, I was headed astray. I was headed off course. I was headed to destruction before I was afflicted, before something bad happened. But something bad happened, and that brought me back to you and to your word. And now I keep your word, and I am no longer headed astray. The devastating results of our unbelief in this area. In the book, I have a quote here from the book. America is suffering, economically and otherwise, because it has moved away from the Creator's rules and design for life. We like to think of ourselves as somehow liberated from God's prison when we throw off the teachings of the Bible. But we only make things worse for ourselves when we do. The suffering God has been trying to bring us, pay attention to this, very critical. The suffering God has been trying to bring us through difficult economic times has been sidestepped, at least for a season, by debt. Let me pause there. What we have done is, in all of these difficulties from 9/11 to the Great Recession to the pandemic, as we have used borrowed money to keep ourselves from having to struggle. But God is intending for us to struggle because we have gone astray. We have gone so far astray, as I will show you very soon, that He is about to strike us with a death blow. He has been trying to discipline us, but we have been slipping around that discipline by borrowing money. The pain that these trials could have brought and the changes they could have worked in us would have made the future brighter. Instead, because of our foolishness, the future is bleaker than ever.